This is HR in Review, a podcast dedicated to HR thought leadership, actionable advice, and all the latest developments in human resource management.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the newest episode of our podcast, HR in Review. I'm Monica Sharma, the editor of HRreview. And if you haven't tuned in before, in this short segment, we'll be looking back at some recent standout stories and we'll be discussing the most relevant topics linked to HR. Each week will be based around a different theme, and this week's is safeguarding employees and the employer's duty of care. Before we launch into this episode, I did want to give a quick trigger warning to our audience. This segment will contain continued references to sensitive issues such as sexual assault, harassment, and domestic abuse. So now I wanted to introduce my guest, Sarah Evans. Sarah is partner at Constantine Law. She is an employment lawyer with over 15 years of experience working with companies and employees and specialising in discrimination litigation. She is also a regular contributor to media coverage of HR and employment issues. Welcome to the show, Sarah. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Monica, for having me. I'm very well, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get straight into the discussion.
Sure.
So I wanted to start us off by discussing sexual harassment and assault in the workplace. As our audience is well aware, in light of the tragic death of Sarah Everard, which happened earlier this year, and earlier movements such as the Me Too campaign, there's been a massive outpouring of people, especially women, discussing their experiences with sexual assault and harassment. So relating this to a workplace context, CIPD research, which took place last year in 2020, found that 4% of employees said that they had been sexually harassed at work over the past 3 years, and women were also 3 times more likely to report experiencing sexual harassment than men in the workplace. So Sarah, my first question to you is, what do employers need to know about their duty of care when it comes to protecting staff against sexual assault and harassment? And does this duty of care change when the behaviours occur outside of the workplace and isn't entirely an internal matter?
The duty of care that employers have comes under the Equality Act, and in terms of general obligations to employees. So we have an obligation to provide a safe place to work, and that includes an environment free from sexual harassment. In terms of the individual rights and therefore the consequent obligations on employers and HR professionals, our duty is to take such reasonable steps as we can to prevent that happening in the workplace. What that means in practice is making sure that we have proper policies and procedures and which are enforced, so that if somebody is experiencing sexual harassment, then they report it and something is done about it. And if there is a known repeat perpetrator, for example, that's not just ignored, because there is a statutory defence, and it is born of this reasonable steps provision, which says if you had no way of knowing that an individual was going to suffer sexual harassment at the hands of another employee, you have no liability as an employer. We've had a lot of case law about this over the years in terms of what that duty is and isn't, and it brings into question many cultural aspects of the world of work, and that's certainly been influenced by the #MeToo campaign, and as you said before, the concentration again and rightly on the safety of women in particular, in all aspects of their life, and the importance of HR in influencing that in the workplace.
So essentially HR have the kind of liability to do everything in their power, including preventing and correcting, to stop sexual assault and harassment from occurring at work, or they will be held legally responsible for the actions of their employees.
Yes, as with any case of discrimination where you've got 2 people employed by you or under your care, for want of a better term, then there is it's the notion of vicarious liability. So anything done to your staff in work is your fault.
Right.
So and again, there is this statutory defence, but it's not necessarily an absolute defence. And it ties into, and HR professionals are really good at seeing the bigger picture, and we definitely need that to be the case when dealing with these issues, in terms of reporting and making sure people feel that they can report, and men largely being made aware that that it isn't going to be allowed. And that's the main problem we have at the moment, is that it is being tolerated, and HR is key in determining that. And I think maybe if HR professionals understand that they do have the power to change culture, and we absolutely rely on them to do so and to drive cultural change, then that's really important. But ultimately, yes, there is a liability issue for employers who turn a blind eye rather.
I suppose that ties into kind of the next point that I wanted to make, which was that the government have actually created a consultation to study sexual harassment in the workplace. And obviously this has been a kind of an ongoing consultation. Would it be possible for you to provide us a brief summary of this and what ramifications this may have for employers and safeguarding?
Follow us on Twitter at HRreview, or join us on LinkedIn and Facebook.
Certainly. So this came about in it was at the end of 2018, when the Women and Equality Sector Committee and the Equalities and Human Rights Commission made a report and sort of canvassed the government, having done their own research about a possible statutory code on dealing with harassment, and particularly sexual harassment. And this was particularly important also at the time because we had a couple of years early seen the demise of the Section 40 liability, which is liability for third parties. So this affected a lot of people, for example, in the hospitality sector, where sexual harassment was taking place by customers and clients, and then so that reduced the liability. So what the two committees had a look at is evidence for introduction of that mandatory duty on employers to protect workers from harassment in the workplace, whether we needed to strengthen and clarify the laws in relation to third-party harassment, dealt with particular issues affecting interns, and whether we need to extend protections for volunteers, and also, interestingly, certainly from my point of view, is whether we need a longer time limit than the 3 months that people have to bring a claim in relation to sexual harassment, given the complexity of the issue. So as a result of that, the government launched a commission, which, a consultation, I beg your pardon, which closed at the end of October 2019. We haven't had the outcome of that for probably obvious reasons, because we've all lost a year last year. So we're still awaiting for the outcome. The introduction to the consultation, though, by the government, I think it recognises the hashtag #MeToo movement, and that we have had a bit of an increase in reporting, and this is very much a live issue. But I do have some concerns about it in terms of it is on the premise that we think that the statutory protection is strong enough already. So whether there will be any changes coming out of it, I'm not sure. I hope there will be, because I think there is still work to do. And I think the introduction of a statutory code, it helps. Sometimes we do have to force change, but a statutory code would certainly potentially clarify in one place, like we did with the Code of Conduct, albeit that that's not statutory, on grievances and disciplinary procedures. It gives employers and HR professionals a code to work from, and it gives them clarity and a bit of clout, so that when we are trying to introduce cultural change in the workplace and support employees, and obviously it's not always women, we know that harassment comes from the power imbalance, but the offside of that is more men have power in the workplace over women than women do over men. But of course, anybody can be touched by this. So what a statutory code would enable, I think, certainly the HR professionals, especially those who are forward-thinking and willing to take on the challenge, it gives them a bit more, stronger teeth to be able to introduce, for example, zero tolerance on harassment in the workplace, it means that they can potentially launch education of all staff, including outside of work. So,
Right.
Obviously the awful Sarah Everard case, and the 10 or so since then were not related to work. But there is often an overlap between work and outside of work, and especially, over the last year where the boundaries have blurred, that there's always been that issue of what happens if an assault takes place at a works do where alcohol is involved, for example, or on out of hours when somebody is receiving abusive texts or something like that. So we already have that mirrored in case law to an extent, but I think it would be especially useful if we can have it in a statutory code that is accessible to all, including employees.
I think that's quite interesting because, as you said, we don't know yet the outcome or whether anything will be reformed. But if that does happen, and it essentially extends the protection, so it's not just for formal employees. It could involve volunteers, interns, and then, as you say, could also work towards educating staff to prevent horrific crimes like sexual assault and harassment from occurring outside of work also.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we are reaching the point where, and often it is the case, isn't it, where we have a tragic event or a high profile event where we concentrate our minds a bit on this. But I have to say, with in 15 years of experience, I'm still having some of the same conversations that I was having 10 years ago. I do think there's much more of a move, though. I think it has the #MeToo campaign, as it were, has certainly highlighted it in the same way as we're about to get similar drive in terms of the Black Lives Matters campaigns as well, and we're about to have race inequality pay reporting looked at as well. So I think all of these things, if we can get them to dovetail and just concentrate on those areas that will improve the workplace and will improve business, when it comes down to it, it is important, and hopefully this is the time where we can make headway with it.
Well, contextualizing this a bit further, obviously our lives have changed so much over the past year. Most professions have moved online. I think something that may have been missed by many is the impact that working from home has had on the level of sexual harassment at work. And according to a survey conducted by the legal charity Rights of Women in late 2020, 42% of respondents had recently experienced harassment from co-workers online, and 70% of employees said that they think their employers are not doing enough to protect them. Again, does this kind of mean that HR need to protect employees more when working from home? Is that more difficult to protect against since it's all happening online?
If you have any comments on the HR in Review podcast, would like to suggest a topic or speaker, or provide other feedback, you can contact us using the email podcast@hrreview.co.uk. We look forward to hearing from you.
I was really surprised by this, and I have to say it wasn't something that I had anticipated at all. Mainly because I hadn't thought about it, because it came upon us quite quickly, I suppose, didn't it? This move to much more home working.
Yeah.
To answer your question, I think what HR has to do is deal with those safeguards in a different way, and that matches the different way of working. And where we've got isolation and isolating potential victims, it is often part of harassment. And then when we've got that 100-fold where we are separated, there's no colleagues around, and that we've seen particular reports about, well, I feel like that this person is now in my house because I'm in my house talking to him or her where this abuse is taking place. So I think we've all been on a huge learning curve with it. And I think HR, I'm sure it's taken many people by surprise in one way. So yes, I think HR have a different job to do. The principles are the same, but how we deal with it is obviously affected by the how that harassment is taking place. So we were starting to get used to, we had the whole upskirting thing first of all, and then social media and cyberbullying and harassment takes it to a whole other level because of the accessibility of it. And then we add in Zoom and Teams calls and the technologies that go along with that, and the isolation. It does change the landscape. So I think HR professionals are well placed to think strategically about, okay, what extra safeguards do we need to put in place? What education and straight talking do we need to have about expected conduct and standards of conduct? And we've certainly seen cases, and anecdotally as well, conversations with other professionals saying, well, Zoom calls have suddenly got a bit informal, and we're having conversations that we would never have in the office because we're at home and we're in our pajamas or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I think it is a matter of different elements of policing and monitoring in one way, but also education.
Well, I think also tied into that, moving on to our second story, domestic abuse has kind of always been on the radar for HR. But obviously, again, over the last year since the national lockdown, the number of domestic abuse offences have soared, unfortunately. During and after the first lockdown, in the April, May and June months, roughly 1/5 of all offences committed involved domestic abuse. So obviously there's been a clear rise in these cases, and I was just wondering what HR is expected to do in this position, because it is all external to the workplace. How far does their duty of care extend in this situation?
It's a terribly difficult area to deal with, isn't it? Because it isn't a work issue of itself. And there is that line between home and work, albeit that as we've just discussed, that has been blurred a lot over the last year with lockdowns and working from home. So and I think it's important for HR professionals to understand that they don't have, they're not the police, they're not social workers, they're not counsellors, and they're probably not trained and nor should we expect them to be, not trained to help with the practicalities and the emotional fallout and the harm that victims of domestic abuse go through. So the duty in terms of work is the same in relation to any other sort of environmental factor, which is to provide that safe place to work, but it doesn't go further than that. I think where the duty does arise because of the impact of somebody's personal life on their working life. So being aware of and looking out for signs of somebody withdrawing, somebody having odd absences here and there, somebody's performance suddenly dropping, and there could be a multitude of reasons and for that, but they tend to be the signals that something is awry. And what certainly victims of domestic abuse have been saying is that that work is their escape from it, which is probably why we've seen the numbers increase as we have. But also a big fear in not reporting it to the police or getting help that means that they can, when the time is right, escape from that situation, is their fear of being absent from work and losing out financially, or not being in a position to be able to risk losing out financially because they might need to go to a refuge for a week or two, or they might need time to recover. and get some counselling. And that's a long-term issue. That's not a 5 or 10 day fix, is it? But there have been some recommendations, and some companies do have policies of 5-10 days paid leave for somebody to deal with the effects of either escaping domestic abuse or dealing with it, as the case may be. And HR is clearly fundamental in putting those policies in place and creating that culture whereby somebody who in such dire straits can come to them and say, this is what's going on. It doesn't mean that HR has to be involved in helping extricate somebody.
Yeah. So there is that sense of distance, because obviously home life and work life are completely different, but there's also some support, especially in terms of perhaps financial support.
Yes. Yeah, and that can be so important, because as domestic abuse is, as we've all read, it's not just that, it's not always violence. It's often financial abuse and emotional abuse that goes along with it. So and people have a right to privacy. It could be, for some people, terribly embarrassing for whatever reason to speak to people at work about it, and they might just not want to, and they don't have to. But if we know that if people, again, generally women, but not always, have that cushion of not having to worry about pay, even for a week, it might mean that they can get the extra help externally that they need.
So, Sarah, I wanted to pose to you one final question. Are there any recommendations moving forward that you would give to HR teams looking to revamp some of their workplace safety policies in light of, the recent events that have happened?
Why not subscribe to the premium version of HR in Review? You'll get ad-free content, early and extra episodes and more. Even better, although it's the premium edition, it's absolutely free. Sign up at hrreview.co.uk/podcast.
I would say that now is possibly the best time we've had for a long time to revamp our policies and to strengthen them. Nobody is going to speak out, I would think, against an HR team saying now is the time that we need to strengthen these anti-harassment and bullying policies, or we need to bring in an education tool, and we are going to do some innovative work that concentrates on, for example, why people harass, rather than simply what do we do to protect the victims. It's a difficult one, of course it is, but I think brave HR teams have an enormous amount of potential to be actively involved in changing the cultural imbalances that cause the issues that we have. So I would say now is the perfect time to revisit those policies, revisit the education of employees, and crucially of managers in dealing with and putting those policies into place. And we all know that it's one thing having policies and it's another thing to actually enforce them. So revamping and relaunching now, and to almost capitalise on this wave of attention, I think will serve HR teams really well in terms of the value that they can bring to the workplace. The law at the moment hasn't changed, so the policies may not need to change, but there is no reason why we couldn't, and HR teams couldn't take or shouldn't take the opportunity to say this is something we're focusing on. We really do mean it when we have a zero tolerance of this type of behaviour, and to put those reporting lines in place so that rather than, as mainly is the case, women leave rather than report what's going on, that we retain that that element of the workforce. So yeah, I would absolutely encourage HR to take this by the scruff of the neck, really, revisit those policies and make sure that they are shared and our staff are trained on them.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for joining me on the show today and kind of explaining the legal standpoints of many of these situations, which are really complex and, sensitive in nature to deal with. As mentioned earlier, Sarah Evans works at Constantine Law and can be reached there. Thank you again, Sarah, for joining us.
Thank you, Monica.
If you enjoyed this, we also do have webinars on Inside HR, which will delve into similar topics. Our next webinar is on Thursday the 17th, which is all about recruitment and how you can really fix that process and rebuild trust when it comes to hiring. We also have one the week after on the 24th of June, which is about redesigning the employee experience. As always, if you're interested in learning more about employment law or any other topic linked to HR, head over to our website, HRreview.co.uk. Thanks once again to Sarah Evans for joining us and our audience for listening. We hope to see you again next time, where we'll be continuing the discussion on the most relevant HR topics. See you then.
The HR in Review podcast is brought to you by HRreview.co.uk. HRreview.co.uk is a website dedicated to human resources and related professionals. News items are posted daily together with analysis looking in depth at topical HR issues. You can sign up for our range of specialist newsletters at hrreview.co.uk/sign-up and follow us on Twitter at HRreview or join us on LinkedIn and Facebook. Thank you for listening.